Okay, hi. So I'm Tadge Dryja. I work on Bitcoin here at MIT at the DCI. Um, I know a bunch of people who work on Bitcoin, Ethereum, Zcash, lots of other projects. Some people I know get paid to work on these things. Some don't. None of us, as my parents would classify it, have normal jobs. That's what my parents have said. Um, so it's kind of an interesting, like generational thing. I don't know. So I'm going to talk a little about funding. It's not directly related to journals, but money matters, and the funding for a lot of this work, whether it be research or more implementation, is really important. And I'll preface it, but it's basically open source funding. So it's a subset of open source funding, but these are similar problems with many open source projects. And I think, as far as I know, all the digital currency, sort of smart contract, all these software projects are open source, whether the license is an MIT license, BSD license, GPL, Apache. They're pretty much open source. There are maybe some that are not, and some things are patented, and I generally steer well clear of those things. It does seem sort of contradictory to say, hey, we've got this decentralized open currency, but here's the binary, run it. And you're like, wait, what? Like, I have no idea what's going on. Although there are probably some out there. So open source funding is tricky, and it's kind of interesting sometimes, because we're literally programming money, right? Sometimes I joke, like, what are you doing? Oh, making money. But funding is not simple at all, and sometimes very elusive. So I'm going to go through some of these funding models, and this is a little bit, they're not well defined, right? There's a lot of blurry spectrum between these things, and some of them have arrows between them and going to one or the other. So I'm going to try to not say too much specifics, because then I don't want my opinions about different projects specifically to get out. But these are some of the broad categories of how you can fund an open source project like Bitcoin or Ethereum or Zcash or something. So I'll summarize. There's no funding. There's the sort of .edu university funding idea. There's corporate donations, personal donations. You can have a for-profit company working on it. Then there's the pre-mine and ICO idea, mining rewards, and then there's also these non-profit companies and foundations. And these are not exclusive in any way. So first, I'll talk about no funding. This was Bitcoin's initial model. It's really simple. There's just no funding. If you want to work on something, you can work on it, but no one will pay you. And so people just sort of work on things that they think are cool or interesting, or in many cases don't. They think something's cool, interesting, maybe want to work on it, but you got a job, you got life, and there's no money in this. So maybe on the weekend you'll do something. This potentially can have lots of people, but they're generally going to be part-time or not dedicate the most resources they have to it. So this is how I think a lot of people who work on Bitcoin today started. This is how I started with Bitcoin. I was like, this is really cool, started reading the code, playing with it. With no expectation that I would in any way be compensated. The fact that I get paid to work on Bitcoin now is actually really cool, and I'm very thankful to DCI, all these people. If you told me, well, I guess it's 8 years ago, that you'll work full time on this stuff, like, nah, there's no way I'll be able to do that. So it's cool. One thing that is really good about the no funding model is there's an easy on-ramp. So if nobody's getting paid to work on this, you can just go make a pull request on GitHub, and you will be the highest paid Bitcoin developer, right? Like, no one's making anything, so yeah, start working on it. This is not the case in other models. In all the other ones, the fact that now there's compensation makes it sort of, is in a way a barrier, right? The people who are not getting paid are in many ways less likely to work on it. From like a game theory perspective, it doesn't necessarily make any sense, but psychologically, it's totally true, right? If someone's getting paid a lot of money to work on something, I'm not going to do it. It's your job, not my job. Okay, so then there's .edu, where we are right now. Academia, I don't quite share all the criticisms Brian might have had for academia, but there's valid. So I tried to get a PhD working on Bitcoin, and I only lasted a year in the PhD program. And I was like, this whole system just doesn't work. This does not make sense. I'm making almost no money. People are just jerks to me, and I'm not working on what I want to be working on. So I left. And like a lot of the international stuff, it seemed a lot of the students who I was working with were not U.S. citizens, and they had. So for me, I just sort of my advisor was yelling at me, and it was always on the phone. We didn't actually meet in person much. And I remember one day I just sort of like moved the phone. I was like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. And I quit. I told them. But for me, it was much easier, right? I'm an American U.S. citizen. I just stopped. I wasn't making much money anyway, so it didn't really matter. I still had rent, but like whatever. But most of the other colleagues I had were from a lot of people from China, a lot of people from India. It was a huge deal for them, right? If they quit their PhD program, they had to leave the country very soon. And it felt like a lot of the professors sort of knew that and used that. And yeah, there's a lot of problems in academia. But the idea is great, right? It's like, hey, we're all just sort of in it to research and advance knowledge, and the idea is good, but implementation leaves still has some issues. One thing that some people have assumed or asked about, they think that there's sort of .gov funding, right? The NSF, National Science Foundation. There's actually very little of that. The DCI here, we haven't, as far as I know, gotten any funding from NSF. I'm not sure we've really tried that hard. There's a little if you look around. Like in 2015, IC3, which is like Cornell and Berkeley, they're sort of a group. They got $3 million in funding from NSF, which is a decent amount. But there's not much in total. And it's sort of interesting. Looking up the IC3 PIs, many of them, most of them, ended up doing things from the rest of that list. For-profit companies, ICOs, things like that. So the $3 million maybe wasn't enough. So there's corporate donations. These happen sometimes. So companies donate money to developers, researchers, sometimes to individuals. So I know that there are people at this conference who have gotten money from a exchange called BitMEX, where it's sort of post hoc. You've been working on Bitcoin for a while. Here's some money, and keep working on it. Bitmain, I know, was funding some people who were working on Bitcoin. And there's many instances of this to groups. So, for example, Fidelity donates money to the DCI, and we work together on talks and stuff like this. So there's some of that. Corporations think, hey, this is an important thing that maybe we're not directly benefiting from, but we're part of this ecosystem. We make money. Let's donate to this. There's also personal donations from individuals to either under other individuals or groups. And in some cases, these individuals start sort of VC-style funds to invest in things, or they start, one of the big ones in Bitcoin is some individuals have started a company with their own money and employ a lot of Bitcoin developers. And that's one of the big things here now. You can also make a for-profit company. This starts getting into sort of trickier aspects where there's some currency, digital currency, smart contract projects that are run as a company. There's regular old shareholders, Delaware C Corp, whatever it is, a board. How is it decentralized though, right? You've got potentially a CEO of the currency. How does that work? So it may be open source, and that can be useful, but it does lend itself much more to centralized development, right? Where if there's this coin that's run by a company, and you want to change it, well, you've got to get you're not in that company. Then there's pre-mines and ICOs. And you could have a whole talk on this. You could have a whole class on this. This is pretty wild. Everyone's heard of these ICOs. So it started with pre-mines, which probably 2011, 2012, when altcoins started popping up. People said, well, I'm programming this altcoin like Vertcoin or Litecoin or whatever it is. Maybe I want to give myself some of the money in this system. So the pre-mine, the idea was there is an initial distribution of coins in the software. In Bitcoin, this was not the case. There is a genesis block in Bitcoin, but either intentionally or unintentionally, the first 50 coins in the genesis block are not spendable and not considered part of the initial distribution of Bitcoins. So everyone who wants Bitcoins has to sort of mine for them, and you're on an equal footing. Satoshi didn't code in a bunch of coins for himself. Pre-mines do that. And then ICOs are sort of a pre-mine, where this started years later, where you want to do a pre-mine, but you haven't actually written the software yet. And you want the money to then write the software. So the idea is you'll give a sort of IOU for the coins that don't yet exist because the software has not yet been written. But you want that IOU to be transferable like a coin. Then people can trade on these coins that don't yet exist. And so that's ERC20. There's enormous markets for that. It seems to raise a lot of money. This one is it's somewhat novel, but it billions of dollars. And also, to date, it seems like an inefficient use of capital. There's projects that have gotten enormous amounts of funding, and at least from my take, haven't had that much interesting stuff delivered, at least proportional to the funding that's gone in. So yes, I work on Bitcoin, so that's my sort of bias here, but it seems like, Bitcoin and some of these projects, not a ton of funding, a lot of volunteer development, which has later become full-time, and people are getting funded. But there's a lot of cool stuff, a lot of cool research. But if you look at that compared to the billions that have gone into ICOs, there's not much there. So it doesn't seem like an efficient use. There's also a lot of legality questions. And maybe the mania is over. Maybe this was sort of a fad. I'm not sure it was really a sustainable thing. There's mining reward. I only know of one prominent one, but there may be others that have said, okay, similar to an ICO in some ways, similar to pre-mine in some ways, but like a vesting schedule for companies where what happens is when coins are mined, some portion of that mining reward goes to the initial developers or initial investors. It feels a little better in that it's like not all up front, because one of the problems with ICOs is you say, okay, I need to make this really cool project. Give me $100 million. And then they get $100 million, and then there's not a whole lot of motivation to actually carry through the project. Because once you have $100 million, there are so many fun things you could do. I can just imagine the fun you could have with $100 million. And sitting in front of my computer programming stuff is fun. I like doing it, but I probably would have fun for a year first. So maybe this mining reward idea helps with the front loading. It's like a vesting schedule. But it does have some similar issues with centralization as ICOs. It also limits the on-ramp, right? And a lot of these, why should I work on your well-funded coin, right? Like, this is an interesting project. There's cool stuff going on here. Oh, I think I have a way that can solve some of your problems. But you guys have $100 million. How about you pay me first, right? Like I don't want to volunteer my resources, my expertise, or my time to a place that has really fancy offices and like nice chairs and like 3 tree houses in their office and stuff. And I've seen these things, and it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. And some part of me makes me, kind of want to work there. And the other part is like, well, I'm definitely not helping because they're not paying me. And they get all the cool stuff and I don't. I mean, we have cool offices. Anyway, we don't have tree houses, but yeah, whatever. Nonprofits. So then there's like these nonprofit foundations that I don't really understand these that well. A lot of times they're linked to ICO. So they'll like be a big ICO or some for-profit company. And then they'll sort of create this nonprofit foundation. So like there's an Ethereum foundation. There's, I think, a Zcash foundation. There's lots of these. But it's also like, where does the foundation get the money? And if you're getting funded, if you're a nonprofit, but you're getting funded primarily from this for-profit company, how independent are you really? And the people that fund you in some way might control you. It's tricky. I don't know if it helps that much. The idea is to decentralize it, but in practice, not clear that it's that useful. There was, maybe still is, a Bitcoin Foundation. You can ask some people here who maybe have worked on that. It didn't go that well. You can ask, I shouldn't name who, but you can look up who worked there, and some of them are here. They probably have fun stories. I have lots of fun stories. It was really hard writing these slides to not talk about all the hilarious fun stories I have about specific people and entities and groups. But that maybe is not appropriate for on stage. So how should we fund these things? I don't think there's a clear answer. One thing I did observe is Bitcoin seems to have like maybe sublinear development costs, in that when Bitcoin was like $20, there were a bunch of people working on it. And then I remember we've had these core development meetings in like New York City. There's one in Amsterdam. As Bitcoin is worth hundreds of times more now, there's not even twice as many people working on it, right? Maybe twice. There's more people working on it as the impact and the price goes up, but it's definitely sublinear. I don't know if it's root n, log n, but it's sublinear, which is maybe good, right? You want it to be, in economic terms, the welfare, right? You want small amount of money to go in and a lot of really useful stuff to come out. So if it's sublinear scaling, that's great. But is it too low? Is it too high? This is also a huge issue with other open source projects. GPG, there's like one guy in Germany who sort of works on it and somehow gets funding sometimes. It doesn't even work anymore. GPG is like pretty broken. Yeah. OpenSSL, everyone depends on it, and there's like very little funding for it, and there's bugs that people find because someone else's problem, right? Why should you work on OpenSSL? So it's high welfare, right, in the economic sense, then that you're not really paying for OpenSSL, and yet you get to use it. So open source software is great in that it's like, yeah, I can download Linux for free on as many computers as I want, and it's great, it works. It's like the same software that people would potentially pay billions for, and I get it for free. So welfare is great, but it may be suboptimal in that it's underfunded in some ways. Maybe you could get even better Linux or even better cryptography and even better systems if there was more funding. Of course, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe that there's too much funding and we're wasting money and you'd get just almost as good with less. I'm one of the people that gets the funding from this open source software, so you shouldn't necessarily listen to my thing that, oh yeah, there should be more funding for open source, right? So, worst case is that there's all these rational agent programmers and designers, and they maximize their own personal utility, and so everyone just starts their own coins and maximizes their shares and returns, and then you get all the talent fractured into tons of different competing coins, and no one cooperates. That's a threat that it seems like with ICOs you sort of get, and like there's coin market cap, and there's so many coins, and why are they all, you know? But there's a rational reason that people do these things, and so it's hard to complain. Best case is that there's some like amazing optimum reward that gets all these skilled people cooperating on high impact projects, and there's like stability and advancement paths for long-term careers. So one of the things is, I'm working on this now. Is this a career? Maybe this whole thing disappears. Like this didn't exist 10 years ago. There was no real funding 7 years ago. Is it a long-term good career choice? I don't know. I still, you know, think about that. The reward being sublinear in system utility for net social gains is good, right? But good luck designing the optimal for this thing. We don't know how to do that. Like markets sort of tend towards getting good results, but it's a hard problem. Okay, so I guess I'm a minute or two over. So thanks, questions. Also, you can come bug me later if you have more questions. And I work around here, so you can come bug me even days later. Thanks. What's good? Oh, no. There were, oh, okay.
It's always me. Tadge, so if I grow vegetables in my garden, and I think they're the best vegetables in the world, I have to convince someone there's value in order to get paid, right? I have to go to the farmer's market, and then I learn from in the farmer's market what customers might want. They don't want it to look perfect because that's what you get in the supermarket, and so on, and price. And so how do you learn about the value of what you're doing to someone else?
Yeah, this is a really hard problem, and especially with like anonymity and privacy. Like, so when working on the Lightning Network software, a lot of times it was like, wait, I kind of want to know what people are doing with this, but at the same time, we don't want to know anything about what people are doing with this. And if you're working on like privacy technologies like GPG, you can't put a telemetry kind of software in there that phones home to some server and says, okay, you're getting a lot of users here. So it's hard. I think one thing that might be interesting is usability studies, where you get people who bring them in a room and try to use these things and see what problems they have. But it's very hard. The traditional ways that companies do this with software is you put all sorts of hooks in it in your website, tracking software, things like that. And in this industry, it's pretty resistant against that. So that's a complication here. We have anecdotal evidence, but it's hard to get more systematic evidence because we don't want all these tracking things. So it's a particularly hard problem, more so than vegetables, because the vegetables, you can just see, hey, did you like the tomatoes from last time? And you have recurring customers and you know them, but it's not like this weird onion market, that's anonymous, and you have no idea who's buying your vegetables and what they're doing with them, and probably they're eating them, but you don't know. So yeah, so it's tricky. Yeah,
so given your worst case and best case scenarios, given all the altcoins and if you just follow Twitter, all the shit talking back and forth between them. So like, where do you think we are as an industry from that scale, from the worst case to the best case?
I think we're going in, we're maybe a little closer to the worst case, but we're going in the right direction. Like the last year or two has been, I'm pretty optimistic. There's like more funding for good stuff. It seems like there's less funding for bad stuff. Like late 2017, I was just like, oh man, I don't know about this. This is going to end badly. But it seems to be going in the right direction, so I'm pretty optimistic.
Comment on your sublinear scaling. I totally agree with you, right? There are not a tremendously large amount of more people working on Bitcoin now than there were 5 years ago. This is a problem. It's a big problem, right? Because the size of the market is increasing, the size of the code base is increasing. You know, you add Lightning plus multiple implementations plus Bitcoin plus lots of, even within the Bitcoin community. What I've observed over the years, I've been in this industry for probably 7 years now, and I've been hiring the entire time. Every single time I interview somebody, the first question I ask is, have you taken a cryptography class? 95% of the time, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And so I asked on Twitter last week, and I tagged a whole bunch of professors, and I said, well, why isn't anybody taking cryptography? And the answer was basically, we're not teaching it. Now, we need more people with the right expertise. And so I want to call out, a couple projects, the Chain Code Labs residency, Jimmy Song teaching, things like this. And one of the responses from that Twitter thread was that, well, okay, so cryptography class is actually a lot of math and proofs. It's not engineering. And so, what we need to see happen in this industry is we need to develop cryptography as an engineering discipline. Like, how do I take OpenSSL and ECDSA and SHA-256 and compose something with those tools and not make something completely and totally ridiculously vulnerable, right? And that's what's been happening, right? All of the password database thefts are ridiculous things about people not knowing how to do, things like salting and HMACs and things like that, right? Because they were never taught this, right? So.
Yeah.
This has to happen.
Yeah, I think that's it. But I will say, before I was actually employed here, I just I'm not sure I should promote this, but I just went to an MIT cryptography class, and you can learn it, and they don't really care because most of the classes have extra seats and stuff. And I've done that a few times. When I taught a class last year, there were people who were not MIT students or students at all, and they just showed up. And if the room's full, maybe don't. But a lot of times there's empty seats. You can go to stuff. MIT's pretty chill about that, so it's pretty cool. So, but yeah. Okay, thanks a lot.